Further the discussion by Cormac Smith, who's a former British diplomat and strategic communication advisor to the Foreign Minister of Ukraine. We'll be speaking to him about this situation and, of course, what has happened as part of the G7 summit on Ukraine and Russia. Thank you so much, Mr. Cormac, for joining us and being a part of the show. I'd like your perspective in terms of how you're looking at what the U.S. president has spoken at the G7 summit, saying that he's had the support of the G7 countries and, of course, is a big win in terms of what has happened between Iran and the United States. But in what ways do you think it involves the countries around the world, especially in Europe, and how this developing situation is going to impact their own futures?
Sana, good evening, and yeah, it's a privilege to join you again. Before I answer your question, can I just, following on from your previous guest, can I just add my own congratulations to Pakistan as a nation and the Pakistani people for the work that your great country has done to try and bring about a resolution. It's fingers crossed, I think, for all of us to see what we see on Friday. Coming back to your question, if we start at G7, there have been very, very positive signs coming out of the G7 for Ukraine, and I will tell you in a moment where I think that links to the peace deal between Iran and America. The most significant thing which came out of the G7 was the commitment from the European countries and Canada. It was very, very significant that the Prime Minister of Canada became the first Western leader, I think, to say that Ukraine will win this war. For too long, we've heard these empty words of "for as long as it takes." So it was absolutely very encouraging to hear Mark Carney actually say that. In terms of the support of other European countries is ironclad, I think. What's more interesting is what support may come from Donald Trump. Now, there obviously was a meeting between Donald Trump and President Zelensky. Donald Trump has said that that was a positive meeting. This was a one-on-one in the margins of the G7. There are no hard commitments from the United States to Ukraine. The main thing which President Zelensky wanted to get was air defense, including Patriot missiles. Let's see if that's delivered, but there's certainly indications that the US will work with European partners to deliver that. That is number one on President Zelensky's wish list. I think also reading it, bringing it back into where this ties into the war in the Straits of Hormuz, President Trump has made it very, very clear that he expects European support to keep the Straits of Hormuz open and to police the Straits of Hormuz, if that is the correct term. We're still very unsure about a lot of the details of the peace deal, and there seems to be a quid pro quo from Donald Trump that additional support to Ukraine will depend on Europe giving support to the United States to keep the Straits of Hormuz open. That's what my understanding is. Very, very positive from Ukraine's point of view, from the point of view of from European support, and in particular from the support of Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, who, as I say, very first world leader outside of Ukraine in 4.5 years to say Ukraine will win this war. I've been saying it for 4.5 years, but I'm just a former diplomat.
We'll take a short break right now and come back with more. Welcome back to the newsroom. It's Sana. We're going to be, of course, taking a look at the developing situation in terms of Iran and the United States. For that, we've been joined by Kathleen Dunbos, who's a foreign policy reporter from the New York Post. Kathleen, thank you for joining us in the newsroom. I'd like your perspective in terms of how you're looking at this particular MOU and the ways in which it's impacting the larger situation in the Middle East. Because, of course, there's one thing in terms of the agreement between US and Iran. There's also, of course, the aspect of Israel that Mr. Trump has also referred to recently in terms of his statements towards Netanyahu and Israel's actions. And so what ways do you think that is going to be able to impact the situation still, especially the very critical 60-day time period that starts once the signing is done?
Right. Well, I just want to start off by saying I just got off the phone with a senior U.S. official who briefed us entirely on all of the text in the MOU. And in that MOU, Israel is not mentioned. What is mentioned is that the U.S. and Iran will collectively with their allies, meaning the U.S. with Israel and Iran with Hezbollah, will end the confrontation on all fronts. So it's very clear that Hezbollah and Israel could throw this whole thing, but I think that that is certainly a point that the Iranian side wanted, not necessarily the U.S. side, but the U.S. side was okay to go ahead and agree there.
Right, but what does that do now in terms of the relationship between the US and Israel and the ways in which Israel's actions towards Lebanon can affect the peace deal?
You know, things are tense, and there's an expectation on Israel that it will not start a conflict with Hezbollah. But on the same foot, the US officials that I've been speaking to, it's also important that Hezbollah does not try to launch anything on Israel. So we just have to kind of call it quits. Everything is called it quits. And the first person to fire a shot, that's the person who will disrupt this entire deal.
Right, so does that essentially mean that both Iran and the US are taking guarantees with regards to their allies?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly how the Americans envision it and interpret it. They say that, yes, we will speak to Israel, but Hezbollah is, Iran is responsible for Hezbollah. If Iran is sticking itself out there and saying that it's such a strong supporter of Lebanon, we know that they're not talking about the Lebanese government, they're talking about Hezbollah. Iran has a responsibility with Hezbollah to restrict them as well if the United States is going to put its credibility on the line to restrict Israel.
Right. Mr. Smith, I'd like your take on this too, as to what it is that Mr. Trump wants to emphasize by mentioning Qasem Soleimani, and also add to that what he's spoken about, the change in leadership in Iran, which many are referring to as regime change, saying that what, of course, was earlier a leadership that wasn't in favor of Iran's own interests or in terms of what the U.S. was dealing with is now gone and being replaced by perhaps more rational minds. And so in what ways do you think that has been something very integral to the U.S.'s military action to begin with, and how exactly does the leadership in Iran have a changed stance that Mr. Trump is referring to?
Well, look, I'm going to be very blunt. From what I'm seeing at the moment, this is looking like a peace deal that has been written by Iran. There is huge gains in it for Iran. It reads to me as a capitulation deal for the United States. President Trump will certainly say now that regime change was never an objective. It clearly was, judging by the rhetoric from both himself and his so-called Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, when they talked about, I don't know, bombing Iran back to the Stone Age, when they talked about wiping out a civilization, when they also talked very, very early on about it would be for the Iranian people to take back their country. Clearly, what Mr. Trump has learned, and it's a lesson that many have learned before him, is that you cannot win a war from the air alone. Now, the problem for viewers, which Kathleen will be well aware of, is that Trump faces midterm elections in the autumn. And the most recent polling that I have seen is that 60% of American voters would be against this war. If it went up to putting boots on the ground, that rises to 80%. So there was, in the early stages, we heard lots of talk about the possibility of putting boots on the ground and taking over certain islands and so forth. That clearly has not happened. I don't think Donald Trump has the stomach for it. So I see this as from what I'm seeing so far, and I will, to a certain extent, hold my counsel until I see the final details. But from everything I'm seeing and hearing at the moment, this sounds very much like a capitulation deal by the United States. It is far more in the favor of Iran. It could indeed be the first war in history where the victors pay reparations to the losers, in terms of there is a figure of $300 billion, I think, to come from the Gulf states, not to come from, I have heard guarantees that not a penny will be, or not a dime will be, American taxpayers' money. But this is very strange indeed. There is immediate lifting of sanctions on Iran. The regime is left in place, arguably stronger than it ever has been before, and free to continue its horrible treatment of its own people. And in that light, I mean, my main area is Ukraine, and I watch Donald Trump very, very closely, and I see somebody who is fast sinking in credibility on the world stage. So I go back to what I said. I think this is a deal which suits Iran far more than it suits the United States. No doubt Donald Trump will try and sell this to the American voters as a victory. I would have a large question mark as to what extent he can rein in and control Netanyahu. I would have far more confidence in the ability of the Iranian regime to rein in and control Hezbollah.
Right, absolutely. Kathleen, I'd like your take on this too, given, of course, the ways in which the situation has put in very huge changes, not just for Iran and the US, but also in terms of geopolitics in general, economy in general. It has also pointed towards the relationships between different countries, including the US's own relationship with the EU. Now, of course, at the G7 summit, we've seen the president talk about how he has to support the G7 countries, how a lot of the countries, of course, are stepping forward in cooperative stances as per their efforts at the opening of the Strait of Hormuz as well. But in what ways do you think, if any, there has been a shift in dynamics between US and